The small town of Fairfield had a courthouse that sat right in the center of its bustling square. It was an old building with tall columns, creaky wooden floors, and a sense of authority that made anyone who walked inside feel small. On this particular morning, the courtroom was unusually full. People had gathered to witness a series of minor cases, but there was an air of curiosity about one case in particular. Angela Williams, a poised black woman in her late 30s, entered the courtroom. She walked confidently, her dark hair tied neatly, and her professional attire reflected a quiet elegance. Angela wasn't the type to draw attention, but her calm presence seemed to silence the room. She carried herself with dignity, which made her stand out in a space often filled with nervous faces. The judge presiding over the courtroom was Judge Miller, a stern man known for his no-nonsense attitude. His white hair and glasses gave him a commanding appearance, but his reputation for being overly strict and dismissive was well known. People in the town had stories about how he handled cases, often with a harsh hand. Today, it seemed Angela had caught his attention. Angela's offense was minor. A speeding ticket she had received a week prior. She had been driving just a few miles over the limit on her way to work. Most people would have paid the fine and moved on, but Angela believed in facing things head-on. So here she was, ready to explain her side of the story. As the case was called, Angela stood up and walked to the front of the room. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Judge Miller looked her over. He didn't hide the fact that he was unimpressed. "Miss Williams," he began in a cold tone, "do you understand why you're here today?" Angela nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor. I received a speeding ticket, and I'm here to address it." Judge Miller glanced at the paperwork in front of him. "You were driving 10 miles over the speed limit in a school zone," he said sharply. "Do you realize how dangerous that could be?" Angela met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand the importance of safety, especially in school zones. However, I was unaware of the change in speed limits in that particular area. I usually take a different route, but construction forced me to use that road." The judge didn't seem interested in her explanation. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "Ignorance of the law is no excuse," he declared firmly. "You could have endangered lives." Angela remained calm, though it was clear Judge Miller wasn't open to discussion. He quickly moved to issue the fine, a hefty amount that made people in the courtroom whisper. It was much higher than the usual penalty for a first-time offense. "Do you have anything else to say before I finalize this?" Judge Miller asked, his tone dismissive. Angela simply nodded. "No, Your Honor. I'll pay the fine." Her response surprised the room. There was no anger, no frustration, just quiet acceptance. As she walked out of the courtroom after settling the fine, a sense of curiosity lingered in the air. Who was this woman, and why did she seem so unfazed by the judge's harshness? Little did anyone know, the real story was only just beginning. The courtroom had returned to its usual rhythm after Angela left, but the whispers about her case hadn't stopped. The people present couldn't shake the strange feeling her calm demeanor had left behind. Most individuals who faced Judge Miller's harsh rulings would leave frustrated or upset, but Angela had simply accepted the fine without a word of complaint. Meanwhile, Judge Miller continued his day, barely giving Angela's case a second thought. To him, it was just another routine matter. A simple traffic violation, resolved swiftly. He prided himself on maintaining order in his courtroom, even if his methods seemed unnecessarily strict to some. After court proceedings concluded for the day, Judge Miller returned to his chambers. The courthouse staff bustled around, handling paperwork and preparing for the next day. It was just another typical afternoon, until the courthouse received an unexpected letter. The letter, marked URGNT, was addressed to Judge Miller and the senior courthouse staff. It came from the company that owned the courthouse building itself, an LLC that had purchased the property years ago. The courthouse operated under a lease agreement with the company, which rarely interfered in its daily operations. But the letter requested an immediate meeting with the staff, including Judge Miller, regarding important ownership matters. Curious and slightly annoyed at the interruption, Judge Miller reluctantly agreed to the meeting. He disliked having to deal with matters outside his courtroom, especially when they involved bureaucratic red tape. He imagined it was probably some minor issue about the lease or building maintenance. The meeting was scheduled for later that afternoon in the courthouse's main conference room. As the time approached, Judge Miller, along with several senior staff members, gathered in the room, chatting quietly among themselves. The atmosphere was formal but relaxed. No one expected anything unusual. The door opened, and the representatives from the LLC walked in. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, just a couple of lawyers in neatly pressed suits. But then, behind them, walked in Angela Williams. The room fell silent. Judge Miller, who had been reviewing some notes, looked up and froze. His face betrayed a mix of confusion and surprise. Angela's presence felt almost surreal, as if she didn't belong there. But her calm confidence made it clear she had every reason to be there. Angela took a seat at the head of the table, her composed demeanor unchanged. One of the lawyers introduced her. "This is Ms. Angela Williams, the principal owner of the LLC that manages this courthouse." The statement hit the room like a thunderclap. Judge Miller blinked in disbelief. "Wait, what?" he blurted out, his usual composed tone replaced with confusion. Angela met his gaze with the same calm expression she had worn earlier in the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor," she said politely. "I own this courthouse." The room was completely still. The senior staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to process the situation. Judge Miller, for the first time in years, was at a loss for words. Angela's calm voice broke the silence. "I believe there are some important matters we need to discuss," she said. And just like that, the balance of power in the room shifted. The room felt smaller now, the weight of Angela's presence filling every corner. Judge Miller sat at the table, still stunned by the information he had just heard. He had never imagined that the woman who had stood before him in his courtroom just hours earlier would turn out to be the owner of the very courthouse he had been presiding over for years. Angela Williams, calm and composed, didn't seem fazed by the judge's confusion. She sat back in her chair, looking around the room with a quiet authority that made everyone in the room uneasy. The lawyers and staff were still trying to process what had just happened. "Ms. Williams," Judge Miller finally spoke, his voice less commanding now. "I didn't realize this courthouse was owned by your company." Angela nodded, not at all surprised by his reaction. "Most people don't realize," she replied. "This building has been in my family's hands for over a decade. I've been the majority shareholder for the last 5 years." Judge Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had assumed, like many others in town, that the courthouse was owned by the government or some faceless corporation. The idea that a local person, especially someone like Angela, held ownership of such an important building seemed almost impossible to him. Angela continued, her voice steady. "I understand that many may find this surprising, but it's been a strategic investment for me. My family has a long history here, and we've always believed in using our resources to make a positive impact." There was no arrogance in her voice, no prideful boast, just a simple statement of fact. But to Judge Miller, it felt like a revelation, a challenge to his way of thinking. "I'm here today because I wanted to discuss how we can move forward with our relationship as owner and tenant," Angela said, cutting straight to the point. "As the owner of the courthouse, I believe it's important for me to understand how things are being run here and how I can help improve the system, especially when it comes to fairness and equality." The word struck a chord in the room. Judge Miller could tell that Angela was not just interested in making sure the building was maintained. She had a bigger vision. "You're suggesting changes?" one of the lawyers asked, raising an eyebrow. "To how the courthouse operates?" Angela nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe there are some areas where improvements could be made. I've already seen how some people are treated here, and I think there's room for growth." Judge Miller opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. He knew exactly what she was talking about. He had seen the way certain people were treated in his courtroom, especially those who were from less privileged backgrounds. The biases, the assumptions, it wasn't something he had ever really questioned before. But now, with Angela sitting across from him, the truth was harder to ignore. "Are you saying that you're here to change things?" Judge Miller finally asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Angela looked him in the eyes, her expression serious but not unkind. "I'm not here to attack anyone. I'm here because I want to see real change. People deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who they are." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time that day, Judge Miller felt like he had been forced to listen. The meeting room was quiet now, as everyone absorbed Angela's words. Judge Miller, though still in a state of disbelief, could sense that Angela wasn't the type of person to make idle threats or empty promises. There was purpose in her every word. But her words also hinted at something deeper, something that had taken root long before she became the owner of the courthouse. Angela leaned forward slightly, as if to underscore the importance of what she was about to say. "I understand that change doesn't happen overnight," she began. "But my family has always fought for change. We've been working toward a more just and equal society for generations." Judge Miller, now more intrigued than ever, furrowed his brow. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, genuinely curious. Angela's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the intensity of her words. It was as if she were speaking about something far bigger than herself, something that was part of a much larger story. Angela took a deep breath and glanced out the window for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "My family's history here in Fairfield goes back a long way," she said. "My great-grandfather was one of the first black landowners in this town. He fought hard to keep his land, even when people tried to take it from him. He believed that owning land, especially land as important as this, was the key to true freedom." She paused, allowing her words to settle in. "When he passed away, my grandfather took up the fight. He expanded the family's holdings, buying up properties that no one thought a black family could own. And then my father continued that work. He always talked about how important it was to have a hand in the things that matter most, like education, like the courts, like the community." Angela's voice softened as she continued. "And now I'm carrying that legacy forward. I own this courthouse because my family believed in the power of ownership. But more importantly, we've always believed in using that power to lift others up." Judge Miller listened intently, his earlier skepticism fading into genuine respect. He hadn't known this about Angela's family. To him, she had always been just another person, like anyone else. But hearing about her family's legacy, the struggles they had endured, made him realize there was much more to her than he had originally assumed. Angela looked back at him, her eyes steady. "That's why I'm here today. I don't just own the courthouse. I'm part of something bigger. And I want to make sure that this courthouse reflects the values my family fought for: fairness, justice, and respect for everyone, no matter where they come from or who they are." Judge Miller felt a shift in his perspective. For the first time, he understood why Angela was so calm, so certain in her words. This wasn't just about a fine or a building. It was about legacy, family, and a vision for a better future. Angela smiled, a quiet but powerful expression. "I want to work with you, Judge Miller. I'm not here to take over. But I do believe we can make this courthouse a place where everyone feels equal." The judge nodded slowly. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something important. A change was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. The meeting had taken an unexpected turn, and Angela's words hung in the air. Judge Miller sat quietly, his thoughts racing. He had spent so many years presiding over cases in the courthouse, never once questioning how it was run or whether his decisions were truly fair. He had always seen himself as a man of authority, someone who knew the system and kept it in check. But now, sitting across from Angela, he was beginning to see things differently. Angela's calm but firm approach was hard to ignore. She was not asking for something drastic. She wasn't demanding immediate changes, but her confidence, her belief in fairness, was a challenge to the way things had always been done. "I can see you're not just here to make changes to the building," Judge Miller said after a long pause, his voice low and thoughtful. "You want to change how we run things here." Angela didn't hesitate. "Yes, Judge. I want to make sure that the people who walk through these doors are treated with fairness and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." Her words were clear and direct. There was no anger, no blame, just a quiet determination to bring about positive change. But Judge Miller, though intrigued by her mission, still felt unsure about how to approach the situation. "Fairness," he repeated, nodding slowly. "That's a big word. But how do you propose we do that? You know this courthouse better than anyone, I assume. What do you see that needs changing?" Angela's gaze was steady as she responded. "For starters, we need to acknowledge the biases that exist in the system. I've been watching how people are treated here, and it's not always equal. People of color, people from lower income backgrounds, they're often treated as if they're less important. I want to make sure that everyone gets a fair chance." Judge Miller shifted in his seat. He knew what she was saying was true, but admitting it out loud made him uncomfortable. He had spent so many years running the courthouse that he had become blind to the little injustices that might be happening around him. He had dismissed the idea that his judgments might have been influenced by his own biases, by his own assumptions about people. "Are you suggesting that I've treated people unfairly?" Judge Miller asked, his voice slightly defensive. "I've always tried to do my job the best I can." Angela met his gaze, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm not accusing you personally, Judge, but the system we operate within can sometimes be blind to its own flaws, and that's where we need to start, by recognizing those flaws and working together to fix them." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Judge Miller found himself reflecting on her words. He had spent so much time focused on the law, on procedures, that he had forgotten about the people the law was supposed to serve. "I'll admit, I've never thought about it this way," Judge Miller said after a moment. "Maybe I've been too focused on the rules and not enough on the people behind those rules." Angela smiled slightly. "It's easy to get caught up in the rules, Judge, but the rules are meant to serve the people. And that's what we need to remember." The conversation had taken a new direction. It was no longer just about a courthouse and its owner. It was about the bigger picture, about fairness, equality, and the changes that needed to happen within the system. Judge Miller knew this wasn't going to be an easy journey, but for the first time in a long while, he felt open to the idea of change. As time went on, Judge Miller found himself reflecting on the changes that were taking place not only in the courthouse but in his own mindset. At first, he had been resistant to Angela's ideas, unsure if her vision for a more inclusive and fair system could actually work. But as he watched the positive changes unfold, he couldn't deny that something meaningful was happening. Judge Miller had always prided himself on being a fair and just person, but Angela had shown him that even the most well-meaning people could be blind to their own biases. He had spent so many years behind the bench that he had become numb to the subtle ways that the court system could favor some while disadvantaging others. Angela's quiet yet determined approach had opened his eyes to the truth that, while the law may be blind, people in power weren't always as impartial as they should be. One afternoon, after several weeks of positive changes at the courthouse, Judge Miller invited Angela to his office. He had spent the morning reflecting on their earlier conversations, and something in him had shifted. He wasn't sure exactly how to put it into words, but he knew that he needed to have this conversation. Angela arrived at the courthouse and walked into the judge's office, where he stood waiting. There was a sense of nervousness in his posture that she hadn't seen before. She had always found Judge Miller to be self-assured, but now he seemed unsure of how to proceed. "Thank you for meeting with me," Judge Miller said, motioning for her to sit down. Angela smiled politely and took a seat, curious about what was on his mind. "Of course, Judge. What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've said. about fairness, about how the court system should serve everyone, not just a few. And I've come to realize that I've been blind to certain things for far too long. Angela listened carefully, waiting for him to continue. She could sense that this was a moment of growth for him, and she wanted to give him the space to express himself. "I've seen how the community has embraced the changes you've started," he said, his voice quieter now. "And I've started to see how my own actions in the courtroom may not have always been as fair as I thought they were. It's been hard to admit, but I think I've been part of the problem." Angela nodded slowly, her expression gentle. "We all have our blind spots, Judge. The important thing is recognizing them and working to do better. And it sounds like you're already doing that." Judge Miller took a deep breath. "I want to do better. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. I want to learn how to be a better judge, one who truly serves everyone who walks through these doors, not just the ones who fit a certain mold." Angela smiled warmly, impressed by his willingness to change. "That's all I can ask for, Judge. It's not about being perfect. It's about being open to growth." The two of them spent the next hour discussing ideas for further improvements in the courthouse, brainstorming ways to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for everyone. They talked about increasing outreach to underserved communities, providing resources for people who couldn't afford legal help, and finding ways to make the courthouse a place where all people felt comfortable seeking justice. As the meeting came to a close, Angela felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt before. Judge Miller, once so focused on the rules and regulations of the law, was now focused on something much bigger: the people who were affected by those rules. "Thank you for showing me a different way, Angela," Judge Miller said as they stood up to leave. "I'm not sure I would have ever seen it without your help." Angela smiled, her voice calm and steady. "You've got the ability to make a real difference, Judge. It's just a matter of putting people first." As they left the office, there was a shared understanding between them. An understanding that change, while often difficult, was possible. And sometimes, it took one person's courage to spark the transformation that the world so desperately needed. As news of Angela's meeting with Judge Miller spread throughout Fairfield, the town began to buzz with excitement. People couldn't stop talking about the unexpected turn of events, how the woman who had once been just another local resident had become the owner of the very courthouse that had long been a symbol of authority. But more than that, they were curious about what Angela's vision for change might mean for them. At first, many didn't know what to think. Some people were skeptical, wondering if a new approach could truly make a difference in such a traditional setting. But as time went on, it became clear that Angela wasn't just another person with lofty ideas. She was determined to make an impact, and her efforts were beginning to show. One day, Angela walked through the courthouse doors, not as a visitor or a business owner, but as someone who was part of the community. She had already begun meeting with local leaders, talking to families, and listening to people who had experienced the flaws in the system firsthand. She was determined to create a space where everyone, regardless of their background or status, felt heard and respected. As she spoke with community members, many of whom had felt ignored or misunderstood by the court system in the past, she began to gain their trust. They shared their stories with her, stories of unfair treatment, stories of feeling invisible in the eyes of the law. Angela didn't promise to fix everything overnight, but she made one thing clear: she was willing to fight for change. Judge Miller, for his part, noticed the shift in the community as well. It wasn't just the courthouse staff who were affected by the new energy that Angela brought. It was the people who lived in the town. The idea that someone who understood their struggles had a hand in shaping the very building that had once been a source of fear was powerful. It gave them hope. As weeks passed, Angela pushed for a series of community outreach programs aimed at raising awareness about how the court system worked. She wanted to make sure that everyone, regardless of their education or income, could understand the legal process and feel confident that they would be treated fairly. She also worked to bring more diversity to the courthouse staff, ensuring that the people working in the building reflected the community they served. One of the first programs Angela launched was a series of workshops where locals could learn about their rights and how to navigate the court system. The workshops were held in the courthouse itself, and they quickly became popular. People who had once felt intimidated by the idea of going to court now felt empowered to ask questions, to voice concerns, and to stand up for their rights. Judge Miller was surprised by how many people showed up. He had always assumed that people didn't care about the inner workings of the courthouse, that they just wanted to get in and out as quickly as possible. But the turnout proved him wrong. The community was eager to learn, eager to be a part of the change that was happening. The workshops weren't the only change taking place. Angela worked with local organizations to provide legal support to those who couldn't afford it. She made sure that every person who walked through the courthouse doors felt like their voice mattered, regardless of their financial situation. Slowly but surely, the courthouse began to transform from a place that had once felt cold and intimidating into a place that offered support, fairness, and understanding. As the community embraced these changes, Angela could see the impact of her work. People were no longer afraid of the courthouse. They felt like it was a space that was there for them, not against them. And in this small town, that sense of belonging and justice meant everything. As time went on, Judge Miller found himself reflecting on the changes that were taking place not only in the courthouse but in his own mindset. At first, he had been resistant to Angela's ideas, unsure if her vision for a more inclusive and fair system could actually work. But as he watched the positive changes unfold, he couldn't deny that something meaningful was happening. Judge Miller had always prided himself on being a fair and just person, but Angela had shown him that even the most well-meaning people could be blind to their own biases. He had spent so many years behind the bench that he had become numb to the subtle ways that the court system could favor some while disadvantaging others. Angela's quiet yet determined approach had opened his eyes to the truth that, while the law may be blind, people in power weren't always as impartial as they should be. One afternoon, after several weeks of positive changes at the courthouse, Judge Miller invited Angela to his office. He had spent the morning reflecting on their earlier conversations, and something in him had shifted. He wasn't sure exactly how to put it into words, but he knew that he needed to have this conversation. Angela arrived at the courthouse and walked into the judge's office, where he stood waiting. There was a sense of nervousness in his posture that she hadn't seen before. She had always found Judge Miller to be self-assured, but now he seemed unsure of how to proceed. "Thank you for meeting with me," Judge Miller said, motioning for her to sit down. Angela smiled politely and took a seat, curious about what was on his mind. "Of course, Judge. What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've said, about fairness, about how the court system should serve everyone, not just a few. And I've come to realize that I've been blind to certain things for far too long." Angela listened carefully, waiting for him to continue. She could sense that this was a moment of growth for him, and she wanted to give him the space to express himself. "I've seen how the community has embraced the changes you've started," he said, his voice quieter now. "And I've started to see how my own actions in the courtroom may not have always been as fair as I thought they were. It's been hard to admit, but I think I've been part of the problem." Angela nodded slowly, her expression gentle. "We all have our blind spots, Judge. The important thing is recognizing them and working to do better. And it sounds like you're already doing that." Judge Miller took a deep breath. "I want to do better. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. I want to learn how to be a better judge, one who truly serves everyone who walks through these doors, not just the ones who fit a certain mold." Angela smiled warmly, impressed by his willingness to change. "That's all I can ask for, Judge. It's not about being perfect. It's about being open to growth." The two of them spent the next hour discussing ideas for further improvements in the courthouse, brainstorming ways to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for everyone. They talked about increasing outreach to underserved communities, providing resources for people who couldn't afford legal help, and finding ways to make the courthouse a place where all people felt comfortable seeking justice. As the meeting came to a close, Angela felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt before. Judge Miller, once so focused on the rules and regulations of the law, was now focused on something much bigger: the people who were affected by those rules. "Thank you for showing me a different way, Angela," Judge Miller said as they stood up to leave. "I'm not sure I would have ever seen it without your help." Angela smiled, her voice calm and steady. "You've got the ability to make a real difference, Judge. It's just a matter of putting people first." As they left the office, there was a shared understanding between them. An understanding that change, while often difficult, was possible. And sometimes it took one person's courage to spark the transformation that the world so desperately needed.